This is a story of heartbreak, betrayal, and the resilience of a mother's love, a story that reminds us how sometimes, the people we trust the most can turn out to be the ones who hurt us the deepest. Our story begins in a small, quiet neighborhood where an elderly woman named Margaret lived all her life. Margaret was 72 years old, with silver hair that framed her warm, gentle face. She had always been known in her community as a kind soul who would do anything for her neighbors, her friends, and most of all, her family. Margaret's husband had passed away 5 years ago, leaving her alone in the modest home they had built together over 40 years ago. They had raised 2 children in that house, a daughter, Susan, and a son, Peter. Susan lived in another state, busy with her career and family. But Peter, her youngest, lived close by. He was Margaret's pride and joy, her baby boy who she believed could do no wrong. Margaret's house was everything to her. It held memories of her late husband, the laughter of her children growing up, and countless family dinners. It was a place of love, warmth, and comfort. But little did she know, everything was about to change. One day, while sipping her morning tea by the window, Margaret noticed a man in a suit walking up her driveway. He carried a clipboard and wore a serious expression. Curious, she opened the door to greet him. "Good morning, ma'am. Are you Mrs. Margaret Williams?" he asked, glancing at his papers. "Yes, that's me," she replied with a warm smile. But her smile faded as the man handed her an envelope. "I'm sorry to inform you, ma'am, but this is an eviction notice. You have 30 days to vacate the property." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "There must be some mistake," she stammered, her hands trembling as she clutched the envelope. "This is my home. I've lived here for over 40 years. I'm just the messenger, ma'am," the man said apologetically before walking away, leaving Margaret standing in her doorway, stunned and confused. In her panic, Margaret did what any mother would do. She called her son, Peter. Peter had always been the one to help her with bills and paperwork after her husband passed away. He was her rock, the one she trusted the most. "Peter, I just got an eviction notice," she cried over the phone. "They're saying I have to leave my home in 30 days. What is going on?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Peter replied, "Don't worry, Mom. It's probably just a mix-up. I'll come over tonight, and we'll sort it out." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. She knew Peter would fix everything. After all, he had always been there for her. That evening, Peter arrived at Margaret's house, but something about his demeanor was different. He seemed distant, distracted. But Margaret, trusting as always, didn't think much of it. "Let me see the notice," Peter said, holding out his hand. He skimmed through the letter, his brows furrowing. "This looks serious, Mom. Did you miss any mortgage payments?" Margaret shook her head. "No, Peter. I paid off the mortgage years ago. Your father and I made sure of that." Peter sighed heavily. "I'll look into it, but it might take some time. In the meantime, just, don't worry, okay?" He patted her shoulder awkwardly, something that felt more like a gesture of obligation than comfort. The days turned into weeks, and Margaret grew more anxious as the deadline approached. She confided in her neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who had been her friend for decades. "This just doesn't make sense," Margaret said, her eyes welling up with tears. "Peter said he's looking into it, but I haven't heard anything. I don't know what to do." Mrs. Jenkins, a sharp and no-nonsense woman, frowned. "Margaret, you need to get a second opinion. Maybe talk to a lawyer. I know a good one who could look into this for you." Margaret hesitated. She didn't want to doubt her son, but the nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. Finally, she agreed, and Mrs. Jenkins set up a meeting with her lawyer friend. The lawyer, Mr. Thompson, was a kind man who listened carefully as Margaret explained her situation. After she handed him the eviction notice, he promised to investigate. A few days later, Margaret sat nervously in Mr. Thompson's office as he went over the documents he had found. "Mrs. Williams, I'm afraid I have some troubling news," he began, looking at her with a mix of pity and concern. "It appears that your son, Peter, took out a second mortgage on your house without your knowledge. When he failed to make the payments, the bank foreclosed on the property." Margaret's world shattered in that moment. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Peter would never do that to me." But the proof was right there in black and white. Her own son had forged her signature, using her home to secure a loan he couldn't pay back. And now, because of his actions, she was about to lose everything. That evening, Margaret confronted Peter at his apartment. She held the documents in her trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this to me, Peter?" she cried. "I trusted you with everything. This is the home your father and I built together. Why would you take that away from me?" Peter didn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom," he muttered. "I was in a bad place. I had debts, and I didn't know what else to do." "You didn't even ask me," she sobbed. "You just took it?" "My own son," she broke down, clutching her chest as if trying to hold herself together. Peter tried to reach out to her, but she pulled away. "I can't believe you would betray me like this," she whispered. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Despite everything, Margaret couldn't bring herself to press charges against her son. She couldn't destroy what little family she had left. But with nowhere else to go, she was forced to leave her home. Susan, her daughter, flew in from out of state and took her mother in. Susan was furious with Peter, cutting all ties with him. But Margaret, despite her heartbreak, couldn't stop worrying about her son. "I know he did a terrible thing," she told Susan, "but he's still my son. I just want him to get the help he needs." Months went by, and Margaret slowly adjusted to her new life with Susan. One day, out of the blue, Peter showed up at Susan's doorstep. He looked disheveled, remorseful, and broken. "Mom," he said, tears in his eyes, "I'm so sorry. I'm trying to change. I've joined a support group, and I want to make things right. Please, can you forgive me?" Margaret's heart ached seeing her son like this. She hesitated, but then, as any mother would, she opened her arms and hugged him tightly. "I forgive you, Peter. But you have to forgive yourself and be better." In the end, Peter managed to find a job and started paying back the debt. With the help of Susan and the community, they were able to secure a small home for Margaret. It wasn't the house she had lost, but it was filled with love and hope for a new beginning. Margaret never got back what she lost, but she gained something more valuable: a son who was truly repentant and a family that stood by each other through thick and thin. This story shows us that sometimes, the deepest wounds come from those we love the most. But even in the face of betrayal, forgiveness can pave the way for healing and redemption. Margaret's story is a testament to the strength of a mother's love and the power of second chances. If you found this story moving, please like, share, and subscribe to True Storyteller for more heart-touching tales like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.